Come closer and let the light go a little lower. There is a story tonight that begins long before history had a name for itself, long before there were words for fear or fire or family. It begins in the dark, in a world that did not belong to us yet. Imagine a night with no streetlights, no walls, no doors that lock. Imagine lying on the cold ground of a river valley, somewhere in eastern Africa nearly 2 million years ago, listening to the world breathe around you. Somewhere out there, something with teeth longer than a human hand is also listening. You're not the strongest creature in that darkness. You're not the fastest. You do not have claws or fangs or thick hide. And yet you are still here breathing, waiting, watching the same stars your distant grandchildren will one day name. That is where this story truly begins. Not with kings or wars or empires, with something smaller and in its own way far more remarkable. The simple nightly struggle to survive until morning. For most of human existence, we were not the hunters everyone assumes we were. For long, dangerous stretches of our early history, we were something else entirely. We were prey. It is strange to sit with that thought. Today, humans stand at the very top of almost every food chain on Earth. We build walls of concrete and steel. We sleep behind locked doors in heated rooms without a single thought given to what might be moving outside in the dark. But that comfort is new. It's a thin recent layer over a much older and more uncertain truth. Scholars who study early human behavior suggest that for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps longer, the greatest danger our ancestors faced was not each other. It was the simple, ordinary arrival of nightfall. Picture the world as it actually was. Africa during the early Pleistocene was not the calm savanna of a nature documentary. It was a landscape patrolled by predators, larger, faster, and far better equipped than any human alive at the time. Cave lions stood taller at the shoulder than the lions known today. Saber-toothed cats moved through tall grass with a kind of patient, terrible sequence. Giant hyenas, heavier than a grown man, hunted in coordinated packs. And somewhere among all of this, walking upright on two legs, carrying nothing but stone tools, and each other were the earliest members of our own family tree. There is something quietly humbling in that image. We like to imagine our ancestors as conquerors of the wild, but the evidence tells a more delicate story. Early hominins were small. They were slow compared to almost everything around them. They had no natural weapons built into their bodies. What they had instead was something far less obvious and in the long run far more powerful. They had each other. This is where the story begins to shift from simple survival into something closer to the beginning of what makes us human. Because when you cannot outrun a predator and you cannot fight one alone, you learn to do the one thing predators cannot easily counter. You learn to watch together. You learn to take turns staying alert through the night so that someone is always awake while others sleep. You learn to read the sounds of the dark, the difference between wind moving through grass and something moving through grass on purpose. Slowly, without anyone deciding it on purpose, vigilance becomes a shared task. Survival becomes a group project. Some researchers who study sleep and early human behavior believe this nightly division of watching and resting may be the quiet origin of something still found in scattered, traditional societies today. Rather than sleeping in one long unbroken stretch the way many of us do now, smaller hunter-gatherer groups sometimes rest in shorter segments with periods of wakefulness in between. It is a pattern that looks almost unfamiliar to modern eyes accustomed as we're to 8 straight hours behind a locked door. But under open sky, with predators moving somewhere beyond the firelight, a broken, watchful kind of rest may have been the safer one. And then there was Hiryu. It is difficult to overstate what fire meant to a creature with no natural defences. The earliest confirmed evidence of controlled fire use stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, found in places like a cave in northern Israel, where burned flint and ash layers tell a story written in heat rather than words. Fire did not just provide warmth, it provided a wall. A flickering, perfect, endlessly valuable wall between a sleeping group and everything that wanted to find them in the dark. Most large predators avoid open flame. For early humans, fire was not a comfort. It was survival technology long before that phrase existed. It is worth sitting with how slow and uncertain this all was. There was no single dramatic moment where humans suddenly became safe. It happened gradually, generation by generation, through small adaptations that mostly went unnoticed by the people living them. A group that posted a careful watch through the night lived to raise more children than a group that did not. A group that learned to keep fire burning through the darkest hours outlasted one that let the flames die. Over hundreds of thousands of years, those small advantages accumulated into something larger. Cooperation became instinct, vigilance became culture, and somewhere in that long, quiet accumulation, the foundations of human social life began to take shape. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history you've been hoping to find a quiet, honest companion for late nights and long thoughts, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what brought you to this particular story. I read every one, and I am always curious. For now, just settle in, get comfortable, and let's keep going. Because what we are really asking tonight is a simple question with a surprisingly complicated answer. If our ancestors were this vulnerable, this outmatched by the natural world around them, how did they survive at all? How did a slow, clawless, fairly fragile primate not only endure, but eventually rise to reshape the entire planet? The evidence remains incomplete in places, and scholars still debate exactly how much of our early development was shaped directly by the pressure of being hunted. But the traces left behind in bone, in stone, in burned earth, and broken antler suggest something remarkable. The fear our ancestors carried through those long nights may not have been a weakness at all. It may have been one of the quiet engines that built everything we now call civilization. There is a particular kind of stillness in that thought. The same instinct that once kept a small group alert beside a dying fire 2 million years ago is something we still carry faintly in the back of our minds. The way a strange sound at night can pull you instantly from half sleep. The way an unlit room can feel different from a lit one for reasons that have nothing to do with logic. These are not flaws. They are inheritances. Echoes of a much older world, one where survival depended on someone somewhere staying awake and listening. So tonight we are going back to that world, not to frighten you, but to understand it gently and honestly the way it actually was. We will walk through the landscapes our ancestors moved through, the predators that shaped their behavior, the fragile technologies that kept them alive, and the strange quiet courage it took simply to make it to sunrise over and over for hundreds of thousands of years. There is more to this story, much more waiting just past the edge of what we know so far, and it is worth staying a little longer to hear it. The world our earliest ancestors woke into each morning was not a single place, but a constantly shifting mosaic of grassland, woodland, and river valley, stretched across what is now eastern and southern Africa. To understand the danger they lived with it helps to first understand the stage itself, because the land shaped everything that hunted across it and everything that tried to survive being hunted. Picture the Rift Valley during the early Pleistocene, somewhere between 2 million and 700,000 years ago. The climate is not. It swings between long wet periods when lakes swell and forests creep outward, and long dry periods when grasslands stretch for miles and water becomes a precious fought-over resource. These swings happen across thousands of years slow enough that no single person would notice the shift, but fast enough on a geological scale to force entire populations of animals to adapt or disappear. Early humans lived inside that uncertainty. Their world was never fixed. It was always becoming something else. And within that shifting landscape moved an extraordinary range of predators, many of which have no real equivalent today. The lions of this era were larger and more powerfully built than modern lions adapted to hunt prey that no longer exists in the same form. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth long enough to pierce deep into the chest cavity of large prey relied on ambush, rather than the long chase which made them especially dangerous in thick brush, or near water, exactly the places early humans needed to visit to drink, gather and fish. Giant short-faced hyenas, heavier and more powerfully jawed than any hyena alive, now hunted in coordinated groups capable of bringing down prey many times their individual size. There were also leopards capable of dragging a kill twice their own weight into a tree, which meant that even apparent safety above the ground was sometimes an illusion. It is worth pausing on something that often surprises people when they first learn it. For a long time, paleoanthropologists assumed that early hominins primarily competed with these predators for the same prey animals, two hunters chasing the same herd. The evidence that has emerged over recent decades tells a more uncomfortable story. Fossilized hominin bones bearing tooth marks consistent with large cats and hyenas suggest that at least some of the time, our ancestors were not competing with these animals. They were the prey itself. A skull recovered from a cave in South Africa belonging to an early hominin species bears puncture marks that closely match the spacing of a leopard's lower canines dragged there most likely after the kill. It is a small, quiet piece of evidence easy to overlook in a textbook, but it reshapes the entire picture of what daily life actually felt like. This changes the emotional center of the story in an important way. It is one thing to imagine our ancestors as clever survivors, outsmarting bigger animals through tools and teamwork. It is another to understand that for long stretches of time, they were simply on the menu the same as any other mid-sized mammal moving across the savannah. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, and scholars still debate exactly how frequently this kind of predation occurred, since only a fraction of remains survive in any usable condition after hundreds of thousands of years underground. But even a fraction of evidence, when it appears again and again across different sites and different time periods, begins to suggest a pattern rather than a coincidence. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in the night that deserves attention here, because this is different from the vulnerability of daylight. During the day, early humans had eyes that could scan long distances, tools they could see clearly to use, and a reasonable ability to spot danger before it arrived. At night, almost all of that advantage disappears. Human eyes are poorly suited to low light compared to the eyes of most predators around them. Lions, leopards, and hyenas all possess a reflective layer behind the retina that dramatically improves their night visions, allowing them to see clearly in conditions where a human would see almost nothing. This means that for every hour of darkness, our ancestors were operating at a profound sensory disadvantage, blind in ways their predators simply were not. This single fact, easy to state in one sentence, carries enormous weight when you sit with it properly. It means that night was not simply a time of rest. It was a time of acute danger made worse by the fact that humans could not see it coming. And it suggests something important about why early human groups clustered so tightly together after dark, why fire mattered so deeply, and why the instinct to listen rather than look for danger may have developed as early and as strongly as it did. Hearing does not require light. A group that trained itself to listen carefully to distinguish between the ordinary sounds of wind and grass and the particular deliberate sound of something moving with intent gained an advantage that vision alone could never offer in the dark. There is something almost intimate in imagining this. A small group, perhaps no more than 20 or 30 individuals, including children and elders, gathered close around a low fire, as the temperature drops and the grassland falls silent except for the occasional distant call of something unseen. Someone in that group is always awake, even if only quietly half listening, half resting. The others sleep nearby, trusting that watchfulness without needing to discuss it. It is one of the oldest forms of trust humans ever developed, long before language existed to express it directly. You sleep because someone else stays alert. They sleep later because you do the same for them. It's worth noting too that early humans were not entirely without defenses, even if those defenses were modest compared to the animals around them. Stone tools, some dating back over 3 million years, were not only used for butchering meat, but likely served as basic deterrents, sharpened edges that could be thrust outward in a moment of desperation. Throwing stones used with accuracy at close range may have discouraged smaller or more cautious predators from pressing an attack. None of this made early humans safe in any reliable sense. It simply made the odds slightly less hopeless, which across enough generations was sometimes the difference between a lineage that continued and one that quietly ended. What makes this part of the story so quietly remarkable is not that early humans were strong, they were not. It is that they were patient, observant, and willing to rely on each other in ways that very few other species manage so consistently. Many predators of this era hunted alone or in small temporary alliances. Early human groups, by contrast, appear to have maintained long-term stable cooperative bonds, the kind that persist not just during a single hunt or a single danger, but across years, even generations. That structural difference, subtle as it sounds, may be one of the quiet hinges on which the entire future of our species turned. There is a temptation when telling stories like this to make the predators into villains and the early humans into innocent victims waiting to be rescued by clever invention. The truth is gentler and more complicated than that. The lions, the hyenas, the saber-toothed cats were not cruel. They were simply doing what every creature on that landscape was doing, trying to survive in a world that offered no guarantees to anyone. Early humans were doing the same thing, just with a different set of tools, foremost among them each other. And so the picture that emerges slowly from bones and ash and the careful work of people who spend their lives studying fragments most of us would walk past without noticing is not one of triumph. Not yet. It is a picture of an unfinished species vulnerable in nearly every conventional sense, finding its way forward not through strength but through attentiveness, cooperation, and a willingness to share the burden of staying alive. There is still a great deal more to understand about how that vulnerability slowly began to shift, how small advantages accumulated into something resembling control over their environment, and what it actually cost to get there. The story is far from finished. In many ways, it is only just beginning to show its shape. There is a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment. If you were to strip away every tool, every fire, every advantage modern humans take for granted, and place a single person alone and unarmed into that ancient grassland landscape, how long would they actually last? The honest answer is not flattering. Almost no time at all. And that uncomfortable truth sits at the very centre of what made early human survival such a strange and improbable achievement. The human body, examined plainly and without sentiment, is a poor design for a predator-filled world. Compare it honestly to the animals sharing that landscape. A lion can reach speeds well beyond anything a human can manage even briefly. A leopard can climb a tree carrying prey heavier than itself. A hyena's jaw can crack open bone that would shatter a human hand attempting the same task. Early hominins had none of this. No claws capable of tearing flesh, no fangs built for puncturing hide, no thick protective coat, no camouflage suited to the terrain, no burrow to retreat into when danger approached. Stripped of tools and companionship, an early human stood in that landscape about as defended as a turkey, standing in an open field. And yet that same body carried something the predators around it did not. It is easy to overlook because it leaves no fossil imprint of its own, no bone fracture, no tooth mark. It lived entirely in behavior and coordination in the quiet decisions made between individuals who trusted each other enough to share the burden of staying alive. Researchers who study the evolution of human cognition often point to this as one of the deepest puzzles in our origin story. Why would a species so physically unequipped for danger eventually come to dominate nearly every environment on the planet? The body alone cannot explain it. Something else has to. Part of the answer lies in a detail many people never learn in school, because it sounds almost too strange to be true. Humans are, by the standards of the animal kingdom, extraordinarily good at sweating. Our skin contains a far greater density of sweat glands than nearly any other large mammal, and unlike most animals, we lost the dense body hair that traps heat close to the skin. This combination allowed early humans to cool themselves with remarkable efficiency, even under intense physical exertion in the heat of the African sun. A lion can outrun a human over a short distance with ease, but a lion, like most predators built for the explosive burst of a chase, overheats quickly and must stop to recover. A human moving at a slower, steadier pace can in theory continue for far longer without collapsing from heat exhaustion. Some researchers believe this unusual cooling advantage may have allowed certain early human groups to practice a form of hunting now called persistence hunting, tracking an animal for hours under the open sun, not through speed, but through sheer patient endurance until the animal itself succumbs to heat and exhaustion. The evidence for how widely this method was actually used remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how central it was to early human survival compared to scavenging or ambush tactics. But even as a partial explanation, it offers something important. It suggests that the body that seemed so disadvantaged in a sprint was quietly built for something else entirely: endurance, patience, the long game. This idea of the long game becomes even more interesting when you consider how early humans likely obtained much of their early meat, which was not always through hunting at all. For a significant stretch of early human history, scavenging carcasses left behind by larger predators may have been just as important, if not more so, than active hunting. Cut marks found on animal bones at sites across eastern Africa, dated to roughly 2.5 million years ago, show stone tool incisions layered directly over the marks left by the teeth of large carnivores, a kind of fossilized timeline frozen in bone. The predator fed first. The humans came after carefully extracting marrow and remaining tissue from a carcass already abandoned or only partially defended. It is a detail that rarely makes it into the more heroic versions of human origin stories, and it deserves a moment of honest reflection. Early humans were not always brave hunters facing down danger directly. Often they were patient opportunists, watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to approach a kill site after the more dangerous animals had moved on, taking what they could quickly, and retreating before anything larger returned. There is no shame in this. It is in its own way a remarkable display of intelligence, timing, and risk assessment qualities that would matter just as much to human survival as any burst of physical courage. What this reveals, layered on top of everything already discussed, is a species whose survival strategy was built almost entirely around information and timing rather than physical force. Knowing where water collects during the dry season, knowing which trees fruit at which point in the year, knowing with uncomfortable precision which predators are most active during which hours, and adjusting movement and rest accordingly. This kind of accumulated, transmitted knowledge passed from older individuals to younger ones may have mattered more to long-term survival than any single physical trait. There is something quietly moving in recognizing how much of this knowledge depended entirely on memory and to communication, neither of which leaves a trace in the ground for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. We can study bones, tools, and burned earth in extraordinary detail, but the actual conversations, the warnings passed between an older woman and a watchful child, the gestures used to signal danger without making a sound, all of that is lost entirely. What survives in the record suggests only the outline of a much richer, much more detailed daily reality that we can never fully recover. In some sense, the most important part of early human survival, the shared knowledge itself, is also the part we can never directly observe. It's worth pausing here on the brain itself because it represents one of the strangest costs of this entire survival strategy. The human brain is metabolically expensive, consuming a disproportionate share of the body's total energy relative to its size, far more than the brain of almost any comparable mammal. From a purely physical standpoint, this is an enormous liability. Energy spent feeding a large complex brain is energy not available for muscle speed or physical defense. And yet across nearly 2 million years of human evolution, brain size in our lineage increased dramatically even as the body itself remained comparatively modest in strength and size. Why would evolution favor an expensive, energy-hungry brain over a stronger, faster body, especially in a world filled with predators perfectly equipped to punish weakness? Researchers who study this question often point toward the same explanation discussed earlier: the deep value of cooperation, memory, and social coordination in a world where physical strength alone was clearly not enough. A brain capable of remembering which group member can be trusted on watch, capable of recognizing subtle warning signs in animal behavior, capable of planning ahead for seasonal danger, may have offered a survival advantage that simply could not be matched by raw physical power. It is a quiet, almost counterintuitive idea. In a world built to punish the weak, the species that survived was not the strongest. It was the one that learned to think and act together most effectively. None of this should suggest that early human life ever became comfortable or safe in any modern sense. Even with fire, even with growing social cooperation, even with an increasingly capable brain coordinating careful collective behavior, the threat never disappeared. It simply became slightly more manageable, slightly less random shaped at the edges, by patterns that could be learned and passed down. The difference between life and death for any individual group still often came down to a single bad decision: a fire allowed to die too early, a watch left unattended for a few critical minutes, a careless step taken too close to dense brush at dusk. There is a particular kind of humility built into understanding this period of human history honestly. We are accustomed to telling our own origin story as one of inevitable rise, as though the outcome was always somehow guaranteed. The evidence does not support that comfortable narrative. For an enormous span of time, our ancestors lived close to the edge of extinction, vulnerable, watchful, dependent entirely on each other, and on a handful of fragile advantages that could easily have failed. That they did not fail that enough. Individuals survived long enough to pass forward both genes and knowledge. Generation after generation is not a story of destiny. It is a story of narrow, repeated, hard-won survival. And it is precisely because that survival was never guaranteed that what came next matters so much. Because somewhere within this long, uncertain struggle, something begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably in the slow accumulation of behavior, tool, and instinct that starts to tip the balance even slightly in favor of the watchers in the dark rather than the things that hunted them. That shift quiet as it begins is where the story turns next. Somewhere along this long, uncertain timeline, something changes that is easy to underestimate if you have never had to live without it. A flicker of orange light, contained and controlled, begins to appear consistently at certain sites, and with it the entire balance of power between humans and the predators around them quietly begins to shift. The earliest confirmed evidence of fire used deliberately and repeatedly by hominins comes from a site called Wonderwork Cave in what is now South Africa, where burned bone and ash deposits dated to roughly 1 million years ago suggest something remarkable. This was not a single accidental spark caught from a lightning strike and briefly tended. Layered ash and the specific pattern of burning found deep inside the cave, far from any natural fire source, point toward fire that was carried, maintained, and used with intention inside a space chosen specifically for shelter. Other sites, including one in northern Israel known as Gesher Bernot Yaakov, push this picture back even further, with burned flint and seeds found alongside evidence of repeated controlled burning dating back roughly 790,000 years. It is worth slowing down on what this actually meant for the people living it, because it is easy to treat fire as a simple convenience when in truth it was something closer to a complete transformation of daily existence. Before fire, darkness was simply danger, full and total, the moment when human disadvantage became most severe. After fire, darkness still held danger, but it held boundaries as well. A burning flame, however small, created a rough circle of light that most large predators, instinctively wary of fire's heat and unpredictability, were reluctant to cross. For the first time in this long story, the night did not belong entirely to the things that hunted. Scholars still debate exactly how early and how widely fire was used as a deliberate predator deterrent, since most surviving evidence shows fire used for warmth, cooking, and tool hardening rather than explicitly for defense. But the secondary effect would have been impossible to miss for the people experiencing it. A group sitting around a fire at night, even one maintained primarily for warmth or to cook food, would have noticed almost immediately how differently the surrounding darkness behaved. The usual rustle and movement at the edges of camp would quiet. The confidence of approach from larger animals would lessen. Fire did not need to be designed as a wall to function as one. There is another layer to this story that often goes unmentioned, and it concerns not predators but food itself, and the strange quiet revolution that came from simply learning to cook. Raw meat and raw plant matter require enormous amounts of energy for the human body to digest energy that has to be spent before any of the nutritional benefit can be absorbed. Cooking changes this equation dramatically. Heat begins breaking down tough fibers and proteins before they even reach the stomach, meaning the body has to do far less internal work to extract the same nutrition. Some researchers studying human evolution argue that this single shift, the regular cooking of food, may have freed up enough metabolic energy over time to help support the growth of the unusually large, expensive brain discussed earlier. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly when cooking became widespread enough to matter at a species-wide level, and the debate among specialists continues, but the underlying logic is difficult to dismiss entirely. A species that could extract more usable energy from the same amount of food gained an advantage that no claw or fang could ever replicate. Consider what an evening might have actually looked like during this period once fire became a regular companion rather than a rare event. A small group gathers as the light fades, perhaps 15 or 20 individuals, children, pressed close to the warmth, older members, watching the surrounding dark with the particular calm that comes from long experience. Meat or roots cook slowly over the coals, the smell mixing with wood smoke and drifting outward into the grassland beyond. Someone tends the fire, feeding it carefully, neither too much nor too little, because both extremes carry risk. Too small a flame and the boundary it creates weakens. Too large a fire and it can attract attention from a different kind of threat or simply burn through fuel too quickly to last until dawn. Managing fire well was not passive, it was a skill learned, practiced, and almost certainly taught carefully from one generation to the next. This brings forward a question worth sitting with quietly. If fire offered this much protection and this much nutritional advantage, why did it take so long across hundreds of thousands of years for its used to become consistent and widespread across human populations? The honest answer involves several overlapping difficulties that are easy to forget from the comfort of a modern kitchen. Fire is not simple to create from nothing. Lightning strikes are rare and unpredictable as a natural source. Maintaining a flame without modern tools requires constant attention, a steady supply of dry fuel and protection from wind and rain, none of which can be taken for granted in an unpredictable climate. For a very long stretch of this story, fire may have been something early humans knew how to use and preserve once obtained long before they reliably knew how to create it from nothing at will. The difference between tending an existing flame and generating a brand new one through friction or percussion represents an enormous leap in skill and understanding, one that likely took an extraordinarily long time to master consistently. There is something almost moving in imagining the loss that must have followed when a maintained fire went out unexpectedly, perhaps during a sudden storm, or through simple carelessness during a difficult, exhausting season. A group that lost its fire before learning to reliably create new flame would have faced a sudden and severe return to the older, more dangerous world. The boundary gone the night once again, total and unguarded. It is reasonable to imagine that fire once experienced and then lost created its own kind of memory, a lesson passed down with real urgency about vigilance, about preparation, about never letting the flame fall too low when it could be helped. Fire also appears to have changed something less obvious than physical safety, something closer to the rhythm of daily life itself. Before, consistent fire used the boundary between day and night, likely represented an almost complete shift in behavior activity, largely ceasing once useful light disappeared. Firelight extended the useful day in a meaningful way, allowing tool-making, food preparation, and importantly social interaction to continue well after sunset. Some researchers who study modern hunter-gatherer communities have observed that conversation around a fire after dark tends to differ noticeably in tone and content from daytime talk, shifting away from practical coordination and towards storytelling, shared memory and social bonding. While we cannot know with certainty how closely this modern pattern reflects ancient behavior, it offers a tantalizing possibility. The campfire may not only have kept predators at a distance, it may have created quite by accident one of the earliest stages for human culture itself, the place where stories, warnings, and shared identity were first spoken aloud into the firelit dark. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this period as one of sudden safety or comfortable transformation. Fire was a tool, not a guarantee. It required constant maintenance, a reliable supply of dry fuel, and careful management of risk versus reward in every single location a group chose to settle. Predators did not vanish from the landscape simply because some human groups had learned to manage flame. They adapted in their own slow evolutionary way, growing more cautious around certain sites, more opportunistic at the edges, where fire's protection thinned. The arms race between human ingenuity and predator adaptation mentioned earlier in this story did not end with fire. It simply entered a new phase one where humans for the first time held a genuine and lasting advantage rather than relying purely on numbers and watchfulness alone. And this is perhaps the quiet turning point worth carrying forward from tonight's part of the story. For nearly the entire span of earlier human existence, every advantage gained against the dangers of the natural world had been temporary. Fragile, easily lost the moment circumstances shifted even slightly. Fire was different. Once mastered consistently, it did not need to be relearned from nothing. With each new generation in the same desperate way, earlier survival strategies often had to be. It could be passed forward, taught, directly improved upon steadily, rather than rediscovered painfully each time. In a story defined so far by narrow margins and uncertain odds, this represents something genuinely new, not safety, not yet. but the first reliable foothold in a world that had offered almost nothing reliable before. What follows from this foothold is where the story begins to grow more complicated because greater safety and greater capability rarely arrive without consequence. As human groups gained more confidence around fire, as their numbers slowly grew, as their reach across the landscape expanded, something else began to shift alongside them, something involving the very predators whose dominance had shaped nearly every choice made until now. That shift and what it eventually cost on both sides is where this story turns next. There is a detail that rarely surfaces in popular tellings of this story, and it concerns something almost embarrassingly ordinary: sleep itself. Not the act of sleeping which every creature on that ancient landscape needed in some form, but the particular deliberate way early humans appear to have organized it, turning something universally vulnerable into one of their quietest survival tools. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to sit with just how exposed sleep actually makes any animal. A sleeping creature cannot watch the horizon, it cannot listen with full attention. Its muscles relax, its reaction time slows, and for those crucial minutes or hours it becomes in the simplest sense available. For most solitary animals, this vulnerability is managed through hiding, through burrows, dense brush, or elevated hard-to-reach perches. Early humans lacking claws to dig and lacking the climbing advantage of a true tree dweller could not rely on hiding in the same way. What they could rely on instead was each other organized deliberately around the simple recurring problem of needing to close their eyes in a world that never fully did. Researchers who study contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose way of life offers careful, imperfect echoes of much older patterns, have observed something genuinely interesting about how sleep is structured within small mobile communities. Rather than every adult sleeping through the same unbroken stretch of night, certain individuals remain lightly alert, waking periodically, listening, occasionally tending a fire before returning to rest while someone else takes up that quiet watch. This is not formal guard duty in any modern military sense. It tends to be loose, informal, almost unconscious, shaped by individual habit as much as by deliberate assignment. And yet across multiple unrelated traditional societies studied by anthropologists, this same general pattern keeps appearing fragmented, layered rest rather than one long shared unconsciousness. It's worth asking gently whether this pattern reflects something far older than any of these particular modern communities. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how directly we can draw a line from contemporary small-scale societies back across hundreds of thousands of years to the earliest human groups living under genuinely constant predator pressure. Sleep itself leaves no fossil trace, no bone fractures to mark a night spent half watchful, no tool bears the signature of a mind kept partially alert through darkness. What we have instead are careful inferences built from comparative behavior, from the physical demands of the environment, and from a simple, persistent logical thread. A group that slept all at once, fully and completely in a landscape patrolled by animals capable of killing silently and quickly would have faced a level of risk that seems difficult to reconcile with long-term survival. Something in all likelihood had to fill that gap. This idea connects to something else worth understanding properly, because it shapes how we should picture these early communities not as anonymous, huddled masses, but as small, deeply interdependent units, bound by something closer to constant, quiet negotiation. Group size during this period appears based on comparative evidence from related primate species and later hunter-gatherer populations to have remained fairly modest, likely somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals for a typical band, sometimes smaller during difficult seasons. A group this size cannot afford much in the way of strangers or indifference or unresolved tension left to fester. Every individual represents a meaningful fraction of the group's total strength, its total watchfulness, its total capacity to gather food, recognize danger, and care for the young. losing even one or two members to predation illness or conflict could measurably weaken the entire unit's odds of survival through the next difficult season. This single fact carries an enormous, often overlooked human consequence. In a group this small and this interdependent, every relationship matters in a very direct, practical sense. The quiet bond between two adults who trust each other enough to alternate watch through the night is not simply emotional comfort. It is functional infrastructure as essential to survival as fire or stone tools. The care given to a child by someone other than its direct parent, an older sibling, an aunt, an unrelated adult who has simply known that child since birth, represents a meaningful investment of limited group resources offered freely because a slightly larger circle of protective attention around the most vulnerable members of the group likely improved everyone's odds, not just the child's own. Some researchers studying the deep roots of human cooperation argue that this kind of broad shared caregiving, sometimes called cooperative breeding in academic literature, may be one of the genuinely distinctive features separating early human social structure from that of our closest primate relatives, most of whom rely far more heavily on the mother alone. There is a particular vulnerability worth sitting with honestly here, because it touches the most painful part of this story without needing to dwell on it longer than necessary. Children, by simple virtue of size, slowness, and inexperience, represented the most consistently at-risk members of any early human group. Skeletal evidence from juvenile hominin remains where preserved well enough to examine closely sometimes shows damage patterns consistent with predation, a quiet, sobering reminder of exactly how real this danger was for the youngest and least capable members of these communities. It is not a detail meant to unsettle, only to honor honestly. The protective instinct that still exists today, the deep, almost automatic vigilance adults feel toward children in unfamiliar or unsettled environments, likely has roots reaching back across an enormous, largely unrecorded span of time shaped gradually by exactly this kind of loss, repeated quietly across countless individual families long before written history could record any of it. Against this backdrop, the strategies that began to emerge make a particular kind of sense. Camps were not placed randomly across the landscape. Evidence from later better preserved hunter-gatherer sites suggests careful repeated selection of locations offering natural advantages, elevated ground that improved visibility, proximity to reliable water, without being directly beside the dense brush where predators preferred to wait in ambush, and positioning that allowed firelight to be seen and used effectively without unnecessarily revealing the group's exact numbers or vulnerability to anything watching from a distance. None of this required written instruction or formal planning in any sense we would recognize today. It emerged slowly through trial, through loss, through the quiet accumulation of lessons passed from one generation of caregivers to the next, each small adjustment slightly improving the odds for those who came after. Here a fair question arises, naturally one worth pausing on rather than rushing past. If early human groups were constantly engaged in this delicate, exhausting balance of vigilance, cooperation, and careful site selection, how did they ever find the mental and emotional space for anything beyond bare survival, for the kind of social bonding, storytelling, and shared meaning that feels so essential to what we now consider distinctly human? The honest answer suggests something quietly profound about how survival pressure and social development were never actually separate processes. The same firelit evenings that offered protection from predators also offered, almost as an unavoidable byproduct, extended time together with nothing urgent demanding immediate physical labor. Hands occupied with simple repetitive tasks like working a hide or sharpening a tool left minds and voices free for something else entirely. It is in exactly this kind of overlap, danger, and intimacy, occupying the same firelit hours, that some of the deepest roots of human culture likely took shape. A grandmother describing in whatever early form of language existed at the time the particular danger of a watering hole during a certain season. A father demonstrating through gesture and repetition rather than words alone the correct angle to hold a stone tool against tough hide. A group gathered close against the cold and the dark, finding warmth not only from flame, but from each other's steady, familiar presence. None of this erased the danger surrounding them. It simply meant that danger and connection had become permanently, inseparably intertwined, two threads woven through the same long nights. There is something worth carrying forward from this particular stretch of the story, something that deserves to settle rather than alarm. The image of early humans huddled fearfully against an indifferent, hostile world is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in an important way. What the evidence increasingly suggests is a species that met genuine, constant danger, not primarily through fear-driven isolation, but through deliberate, patient connection, choosing again and again across countless individual nights, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years to trust each other enough to close their eyes. That trust, fragile and hard-won as it was, would soon be tested in ways that went beyond simple nighttime vigilance as growing human confidence and growing human numbers began to shift the relationship between people and the predators who had shaped nearly every choice made until now. What that shift cost and what it eventually changed is where the story turns next. Picture for a moment what success quietly looks like when it arrives slowly enough that no one alive notices it happening. There is no single morning when early humans woke up safe. There is no fossil layer marked with a sudden dramatic line separating prey from something else. Instead, across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, something subtler occurs. The balance that had defined nearly every night for hundreds of thousands of years begins very gradually to tilt. By roughly 400,000 years ago, the archaeological record starts to show a different kind of human presence on the landscape, one marked not just by survival, but by a growing capacity to shape the environment rather than simply endure it. Stone tools become more refined with techniques like the Levallois method, allowing toolmakers to strike consistent sharp-edged flakes from a single prepared core, producing weapons and implements with a precision earlier generations could not have managed. Wooden spears, including a remarkably well-preserved example found at a site called Schköningen in present-day Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, show careful, deliberate craftsmanship weighted and balanced in a way that suggests these were not simply sharpened sticks grabbed in desperation, but purpose-built tools designed and likely passed down with real instructional care. This growing capability did not arrive in isolation. It coincided with something equally significant, a slow but steady increase in group size and coordination, allowing early humans to do something that would have been almost unthinkable earlier in this story: hunt large animals directly rather than relying primarily on scavenging or retreat. Evidence from several European sites suggests organized group hunting of substantial prey, including horses, and even in some cases animals as large and dangerous as straight-tusked elephants, an undertaking that would have required not just tools, but careful planning, communication, and a level of mutual trust that earlier smaller groups may not have been able to sustain. It's worth pausing here gently on what this shift actually meant for the relationship between humans and the predators who had shaped nearly every choice made until now. A species capable of bringing down a horse through coordinated effort is no longer simply hiding from the lions and hyenas sharing its landscape. It has become, in a very real sense, a competitor for the same resources and in certain specific circumstances increasingly capable of defending itself directly, rather than relying solely on avoidance and vigilance. This raises a fair question, one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Did the predators who had hunted early humans for so long simply continue as before, unaware that the balance around them was shifting? Or did they adapt in their own way to this growing human capability? The evidence here grows harder to read with confidence, and scholars still debate exactly how much direct behavioral change in predator species can be attributed to increasing human presence during this period, since predator behavior leaves far less durable evidence than human tool-making does. What we can observe, though, is a notable shift in the fossil and archaeological record regarding certain large carnivore populations across parts of Europe and Asia during the Middle Pleistocene periods of decline that roughly, though not perfectly, track alongside increasing human territorial range and hunting capability. Cave bears, for instance, animals significantly larger than modern brown bears, appear to have gradually retreated from certain cave systems that show increasing evidence of human use during overlapping time periods. Whether this reflects direct competition climate pressures unrelated to human presence or some combination of both remains genuinely uncertain. And it would be dishonest to present this as a simple, clean story of human triumph displacing animal weakness. The natural world rarely organizes itself into such tidy narratives. What seems most likely, based on the available evidence, is something messier and more gradual. A slow renegotiation of territory and risk playing out across thousands of years, shaped by climate, by resource availability, and yes, by the steadily growing capability of one particular increasingly coordinated species. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people because it complicates the comfortable assumption that this period represents an uncomplicated human victory. Even as certain human groups grew more capable hunters, the danger from predators did not simply disappear, and in some specific, well-documented cases, it appears to have temporarily intensified rather than diminished. As human groups expanded their territorial range following game animals into new regions, and competing more directly for the same kills that large carnivores depended on, they sometimes found themselves in more frequent, more direct confrontation with exactly the animals they were gradually learning to outmatch. Several European cave sites from this period show evidence of what researchers interpret as direct conflict between humans and cave lions or cave bears over contested den sites. Conflict that, given the relative size and power still held by these animals, would have carried serious, sometimes fatal risk for the humans involved. This complicates the simple, comforting version of this story in an important way. Growing human capability did not mean growing human safety in any immediate, straightforward sense. It meant something closer to a shift in the type of risk being faced. Earlier in this story, danger came primarily from human vulnerability from being hunted, while largely unable to fight back effectively. During this period, danger increasingly came from direct confrontation and competition. Humans actively choosing to enter dangerous situations, contest valuable territory, and challenge animals still fully capable of killing them, because the potential reward, a secure cave shelter, access to reliable water, proximity to migrating herds, had become worth the risk. It's worth sitting honestly with what this required psychologically, because it represents a genuine shift in how early humans related to danger itself. For most of this story so far, the dominant survival strategy has been avoidance, vigilance, retreat, and patient endurance. This period required something additional, a willingness, at least among certain individuals within a group, to actively confront danger directly, when circumstances demanded it, to walk toward a contested den site, rather than simply avoiding it, trusting in tools, coordination, and collective courage built through countless earlier nights of shared vigilance and accumulated trust. There is a particular kind of quiet courage worth recognizing here, easy to overlook in a story so often told through tools and bones rather than emotion. The individuals who first stood their ground against a cave bear defending its den, who first organized a coordinated effort to drive a pride of lions away from a valuable water source, were not acting from blind bravado. They were drawing on generations of accumulated knowledge about animal behavior, about timing, about the specific vulnerabilities of different predator species, knowledge passed down carefully through exactly the kind of firelit teaching described earlier in this story. Courage in this context was not the absence of fear. It was fear carefully managed and channeled through preparation, trust, and collective experience. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how widespread or how organized these early confrontations actually were, and it would be a mistake to imagine large coordinated battles in the dramatic sense modern audiences sometimes picture. More likely, these were smaller, tense situational encounters, a group cautiously approaching a den site they suspected might be vacant, only to discover otherwise forcing quick, difficult decisions made under real immediate pressure. But even at this modest scale, the cumulative effect across many such encounters repeated over thousands of years across an expanding human range would have gradually shifted the broader pattern of who controlled which territories and under what conditions. What emerges from this period then is not a clean story of human dominance arriving suddenly and completely. It is something more honest and in its own way more interesting. A long, uneven, often dangerous renegotiation between humans and the predators who had defined their world for so long played out gradually across countless individual decisions, individual risks, individual losses and survivals, none of which any single person living through it could have recognized as part of a larger historical pattern. They were simply trying to keep their group fed, sheltered and alive through one more season, one more winter, one more uncertain stretch of unpredictable weather and shifting prey migration. And yet, looking back across the long arc of this story, it becomes possible to see something these individuals could not have seen themselves. A gradual, hard-won shift in confidence, capability, and territorial control achieved not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the patient accumulation of tools, knowledge, cooperation, and yes, occasional necessary courage stretched across hundreds of thousands of years and countless individual lives. This growing confidence, this expanding capability would soon bring early human groups face to face with challenges that went beyond simple predator confrontation. Challenges that would test the very cooperation and trust that had carried them this far in ways that the story has not yet fully revealed. That test and what it reveals about the deeper cost of survival is where this story turns next. There is a place in South Africa, a low limestone cave called Swart Krans, that holds one of the most quietly devastating pieces of evidence in this entire story, and it deserves to be told carefully the way it actually happened, rather than the way it was first imagined. For much of the 20th century, the bones recovered from Swart Krans and nearby cave sites were interpreted through a very different lens. An anatomist named Raymond Dart, examining damaged early hominin skulls recovered from similar deposits at a site called Tong, decades earlier, proposed a striking theory. He believed the fractures and punctures he observed were evidence of violence committed by early hominins against each other, proof of an aggressive weapon-wielding ancestor he described memorably as a killer ape. For years, this idea shaped how the public imagined human origins, a story of inherent violence stretching back to our earliest ancestors. Later, more careful research told a different, and in its own way far more sobering story. When researchers compared the puncture marks on these ancient skulls against the dimensions of the canine teeth and jaw structure of large cats known to have lived in the same region during the same period, the match was unmistakable. These were not wounds inflicted by another hominin wielding a weapon. They were the precise characteristic puncture pattern of a leopard's bite. The same spacing, the same depth, consistent with an animal carrying its kill skull first into the safety of a tree or a cave to feed undisturbed. The killer was never another hominin. It was in case after case simply the cave's other resident, This single correction, quiet as it might sound, stated plainly changes the entire emotional weight of this part of the story. It would have been almost comforting in a strange way to imagine early human violence as the central danger of this era, because violence, however terrible, at least implies agency choice, something that could theoretically have been reasoned with or avoided through better judgment. What the bones at Swartkrans actually show is something colder and more impersonal. These individuals were not killed in conflict. They were killed the way a smaller, weaker animal is killed by a larger one in any ecosystem, without malice, without meaning, simply because the opportunity existed and the leopard was hungry. It's worth sitting honestly with what daily life must have felt like for groups living with this kind of reality as an ordinary recurring possibility, not a rare catastrophe, but a familiar shape of risk, understood by everyone old enough to remember a previous loss. Mainstream archaeology points towards sites like Swartkrans representing not isolated incidents, but a broader repeated pattern across multiple cave systems in the region, accumulated across thousands of years of overlapping predator and hominin use of the same limited valuable shelter sites. Caves offered protection from weather and from some threats, but they also represented contested desirable real estate, equally attractive to the leopards, hyenas, and other carnivores sharing the same landscape who often use these same caves as denning and feeding sites of their own. This raises an uncomfortable but important question. One this story owes its listeners an honest answer to. If caves were this dangerous, contested by exactly the animals early humans most needed to avoid, why did human groups continue using them at all, rather than avoiding cave shelter entirely? The answer, as is often the case in this story, comes down to a brutal calculation of competing risks rather than any single safe option. Open ground at night exposed a group to a different, often more immediate set of dangers, particularly ambush predators relying on darkness and concealment. A cave, even one occasionally used by other animals, offered a defined, limited number of entry points that could be watched blocked partially with fire or brush, and defended far more effectively than an open camp with danger potentially approaching from any direction. Choosing a cave was not choosing safety. It was choosing the lesser of two genuinely dangerous options, a pattern that recurs again and again throughout this period of human history. There is a particular kind of weight worth acknowledging in the fact that children appear disproportionately represented among these predation victims at several of these sites, a detail confirmed through careful analysis of bone size and developmental markers. This is not surprising once you consider it honestly, even though it is difficult to hold. Smaller, slower, less experienced at recognizing danger, children represented an easier target for any predator weighing the risk and reward of an attempted kill. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how communities responded emotionally to this recurring loss, since grief, like memory and warning, leaves almost no trace in stone or bone. But it is reasonable and important to imagine that this risk-shaped behavior, profoundly explaining in part why so much of early human social structure discussed earlier in this story oriented itself so heavily around shared vigilant caregiving for the youngest members of any group. What makes this part of the story particularly important to tell honestly is what it reveals about the actual nature of brutality during this period, as opposed to the version sometimes imagined in popular culture. This was rarely brutality in the dramatic, intentional sense, predator stalking prey through a tense, prolonged chase, ending in violent confrontation. More often based on the careful, patient evidence preserved at sites like Swartkrans, it was brutality through simple, repeated opportunity. A moment of carelessness near a cave entrance at dusk. A child who wandered slightly too far from the group while gathering. A leopard already resting nearby taking advantage of a chance that required almost no effort at all. The horror here is not in any single dramatic encounter. It is in the sheer grinding ordinariness of the risk repeated across countless individual lives over an almost unimaginable span of time. Scholars still debate the precise frequency of this kind of predation across different regions and time periods, since cave preservation conditions vary enormously, and many sites likely existed where similar events occurred without leaving any evidence durable enough to survive into the present day. What we have at places like Swakrans represents at best a partial window into a much larger, largely invisible pattern, stretched across the full breadth of early human existence. Even accounting for this uncertainty, though, the broader picture remains consistent and sobering. For an enormous span of human history, predation was not a distant occasional threat. It was a present recurring feature of ordinary life, woven into the calculation behind nearly every choice a group made about where to shelter, how closely to supervise children, and how carefully to maintain vigilance through every single night. There is something worth carrying forward from this difficult, necessary part of the story, even as it asked listeners to sit with genuine weight rather than comfortable distance. The fact that human groups continued generation after generation to gather to care for their young, to share fire and food and knowledge, despite this constant grinding risk, speaks to something remarkable about resilience that deserves recognition alongside the loss itself. These were not communities paralyzed by fear into isolation or despair. They adapted, they learned, they passed forward increasingly refined strategies for managing exactly this kind of danger, slowly, imperfectly, but persistently across a span of time, longer than almost anything else discussed so far in this story. It's worth noting too that this period of intense direct predation risk did not last forever in the same severe form. As the strategies discussed earlier in this story fire, coordinated hunting, careful site selection, increasingly capable tools continued to develop and spread, the specific devastating pattern visible at sites like Swakrans appears to diminish somewhat in later archaeological layers from the same region, suggesting that human groups gradually found ways to manage this particular risk more effectively over time. The danger never disappeared entirely, it simply became slowly and unevenly somewhat less likely to end in exactly this way. What this part of the story leaves us with, then, is not simply a record of loss, though the loss deserves to be acknowledged honestly and without flinching. It leaves us with a clearer understanding of exactly what survival actually demanded during this period, not abstract courage in some grand dramatic sense, but constant, exhausting, generation-spanning vigilance applied to the smallest, most ordinary moments of daily life. A doorway watched carefully at dusk, a child kept close during the most dangerous hours, a cave chosen however imperfectly, with real thought given to which risks could be managed, and which simply had to be accepted as the unavoidable cost of shelter in a contested, dangerous world. The bones recovered from places like Swakrans, studied so carefully by researchers determined to understand them accurately, rather than dramatically offer something valuable precisely because they correct an old, comfortable story with a harder, more honest one. And once that correction is understood, it opens an important further question. 1. This story has not yet fully addressed. If the physical evidence tells us this much about how early humans died, what does it tell us with equal care and equal honesty about exactly how they lived, what they ate, where they slept, and how their daily world was actually organized beyond simply the danger that shaped it? That fuller picture, built carefully from everything the evidence can responsibly tell us, is where this story turns next. There is a particular kind of patience required to read the past correctly, and nowhere is that patience tested more than in the quiet, methodical work of piecing together what daily life actually looked like, beyond simply cataloguing the dangers that surrounded it. Footprints of all things offer some of the most vivid evidence available precisely because they capture a single ordinary moment frozen by chance rather than design. At a site called Letoli in present-day Tanzania, a set of footprints preserved in hardened volcanic ash dated to roughly 3,600,000 years ago show 2, possibly 3 individuals walking upright across open ground, their stride pattern remarkably similar to a modern human's. There is nothing dramatic captured in these footprints. No flight, no chase, no sign of danger at all. Just an ordinary walk taken on an ordinary day by individuals who had no idea their passing steps would still be legible to anyone nearly 3,600,000 years later. There is something quietly moving in that. The vast majority of early human life was not crisis. It was walking, gathering, resting, and walking in the same unremarkable rhythm that fills most days in any era, including this one. More recently, a separate set of footprints discovered along the shore of White Sands in what is now New Mexico, dated through careful analysis of seed layers to somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, tells a slightly different, equally human story. Among the tracks, researchers identified the path of an adult, likely a young woman based on stride and foot size carrying a child on one hip across a muddy lakeshore. The child's footprints appearing briefly at certain points where she was set down before being picked up again. It is a detail almost unbearably ordinary and unbearably moving, at the same time separated from any modern parent's experience by tens of thousands of years, and yet recognizable instantly as exactly what it looks like. A tired arm, a fussing child, a short rest, then continuing on. These kinds of discoveries matter enormously to how this story should actually be told, because they correct a subtle but important imbalance. Most of the evidence discussed earlier in this story, the bones bearing predator, marks, the cave sites showing conflict and loss, naturally emphasizes danger, because danger leaves dramatic, durable evidence behind. Ordinary days, by contrast, tend to leave faint, easily overlooked traces. A stray footprint, a discarded tool, a hearth used and reused many times until its ash layers blend together into something archaeologists call a palimpsest. A record so overwritten by repetition that individual moments become almost impossible to separate. The evidence remains incomplete in an important specific way here. Not because danger was somehow rarer than this story has suggested, but because safety and routine by their very nature are quieter, leaving less behind for anyone to find later. Diet offers another useful window into this fuller picture, and it complicates a popular simplified image many people carry of early human eating habits. Microscopic analysis of dental tartar, preserved on fossilized teeth examined under careful laboratory conditions, has revealed starch granules from roots tubers and grass seeds embedded directly in the calculus evidence that plant foods made up a far larger, more consistent portion of the early human diet than older, meat-focused narratives once assumed. This does not mean meat was unimportant. Isotopic analysis of bone collagen from various sites confirms that animal protein obtained through both scavenging and hunting remained a significant and at times dominant part of the diet, particularly in colder regions where plant food was scarce for much of the year. What the fuller picture actually shows is something more balanced, and in its way more impressive than a simple hunter narrative. Early humans were remarkably flexible eaters capable of shifting between heavily plant-based and heavily meat-based diets depending on season, region, and opportunity, a flexibility that may have mattered just as much to long-term survival as any single hunting or gathering skill. There is a particular detail buried within this dietary evidence that surprises many people when they first encounter it. Analysis of certain early human remains shows clear evidence of significant honey consumption, identified through specific markers in dental ware and isotopic signatures consistent with high sugar intake from wild sources. Obtaining this honey would have required real risk approaching active beehives often defended fiercely by their inhabitants, sometimes located in difficult exposed positions on cliff faces or high branches. Modern hunter-gatherer groups still practicing traditional honey gathering, today observed carefully by anthropologists, sometimes use smoke from small fires to calm bees before extracting combs, a technique that may well stretch back much further than currently documented evidence can confirm. It is a small, sweet detail easily overlooked, and yet it reveals something true about early human character that deserves more attention than it usually receives. These were not people who simply avoided every possible risk in favor of pure safety. They weighed risk against reward constantly, deliberately, and sometimes the reward of something as simple as honey was judged worth the danger involved in obtaining it. Shelter 2 offers evidence worth examining carefully because it reveals a level of deliberate planning that complicates any image of early humans as purely reactive, simply enduring whatever the landscape offered. At a site called Terra Amata along the southern coast of France, archaeologists uncovered evidence interpreted by some researchers as the remains of deliberately constructed huts' oval arrangements of post holes and supporting stones dated to roughly 400,000 years ago, suggesting structures built intentionally rather than simply found and occupied. The interpretation of this particular site remains debated among specialists and scholars. Still disagree over how confidently we can describe these as true constructed dwellings, rather than natural or coincidental arrangements of stone and post. But taken alongside other less disputed evidence of constructed shelter from various periods and regions, a consistent picture begins to emerge. Early humans were not passive occupants of whatever shelter nature happened to provide. They actively shape their environment, however modestly, to better suit their specific needs for protection, warmth, and defensible space. This capacity for deliberate environmental modification connects meaningfully to something discussed earlier in this story, the careful repeated selection of camp and cave locations based on visibility, water access, and defensibility. What the fuller evidence now suggests is that this careful selection extended beyond simply choosing existing locations. It included actively modifying those locations once chosen, clearing brush that might conceal a predator's approach, arranging stones to create a partial windbreak or barrier, positioning fire pits at specific points designed to maximize both warmth and visible deterrent effect. None of this required the kind of large-scale construction familiar from later human history. It required something more modest and in its own way equally impressive attention judgment, and the accumulated transmitted knowledge of what specific small adjustments had helped previous groups survive similar circumstances. There is a reasonable question worth pausing on here, one that connects everything discussed so far into a more complete picture. If early humans possessed this level of careful planning, dietary flexibility, and environmental modification, why does popular imagination so often default to a much simpler, more primitive image? People barely surviving, reacting purely to immediate threat without any capacity for foresight or deliberate strategy. Part of the answer likely lies in exactly the imbalance mentioned earlier. Dramatic evidence of danger surviving more readily than quiet evidence of routine competence. But part of the answer may also lie in a simple, understandable bias in how this story tends to get told favouring drama and danger, because they capture attention more easily than careful planning and patient routine ever could. This part of the story exists in part to correct that imbalance honestly. Early human life was genuinely dangerous in ways already explored in considerable honest detail throughout this telling. But it was not purely danger. It was also planning flexibility, deliberate risk assessment, and the quiet accumulated competence of countless individuals who day after day made careful decisions about where to walk, what to eat, where to shelter, and how to balance the constant underlying threat of predation against the equally constant, equally pressing needs of survival. The footprints at Laetolian white sands, the starch granules embedded in ancient teeth, the careful post holes preserved at Terra Amata, all of these quiet, easily overlooked details tell a story every bit as important as the dramatic predator Marx discussed earlier. They tell us that early humans were not simply surviving moment to moment. They were thinking, planning, and adapting across generations, with a level of deliberate care that deserves genuine respect, rather than the simplified instinct-driven image so often assigned to this period. What remains, though, is an honest acknowledgement that even this fuller, more balanced picture comes from a frustratingly incomplete record pieced together from scattered sites separated by vast stretches of time and geography, each offering only a partial, imperfect window into a much larger, largely invisible whole. Researchers studying this period must constantly weigh competing interpretations, balancing what the physical evidence directly shows against what can only be reasonably inferred from comparison pattern and careful informed speculation. And this raises an important further question, one that deserves careful, honest attention before this story can move forward responsibly. How do specialists actually navigate these competing interpretations when the evidence allows for more than one reasonable conclusion, and what happens when respected researchers looking at the very same bones and stones arrive at genuinely different understandings of what they mean? That question and the careful, sometimes contentious process of scholarly debate behind it is where this story turns next. There is a particular kind of disagreement in science that rarely makes it into popular retellings, not because it is uninteresting, but because it resists tidy resolution. It is the disagreement that happens not between right and wrong, but between two careful, well-evidenced interpretations of the very same fragment of bone, the very same scattered ash, each pointing toward a slightly different version of the past. Consider the question of how much predation pressure actually shaped early human evolution, a debate that has run in various forms for several decades among paleoanthropologists. One school of thought, sometimes associated with researchers who emphasize what is called the social brain hypothesis, argues that the primary driver behind increasing brain size and cooperative behavior in early humans was not predator avoidance directly, but the growing complexity of managing relationships within larger, more interdependent social groups. Tracking who owes whom a favor, who can be trusted, who has wronged whom recently requires a different, arguably more demanding kind of intelligence than simply watching for a leopard at dusk. Researchers in this camp point to comparative studies across primate species showing a consistent correlation between group size and relative brain size, suggesting that social complexity itself, not predator pressure, was the primary engine behind human cognitive development. A different group of researchers, without necessarily rejecting the importance of social complexity, places greater emphasis on the direct, repeated pressure of predation discussed throughout much of this story so far. They point to the kind of evidence found at sites like Swartkrans, the consistent repeated pattern of predator marks on early hominin remains, and argue that a species facing this level of sustained lethal threat would have faced enormous direct selective pressure, favouring exactly the traits already discussed: cooperative vigilance, shared caregiving, and the kind of group cohesion necessary to manage genuinely existential risk on a near-nightly basis. The honest, slightly unsatisfying truth, the kind of truth this story has tried to honour throughout, is that these two explanations are not actually in direct competition with each other. Most researchers working in this field today would acknowledge that social complexity and predation pressure likely reinforced each other, each making the other more important rather than cancelling each other out. A group facing serious predation risk benefits enormously from strong, trustworthy social bonds. A group with strong, complex social bonds becomes correspondingly better equipped to manage shared external threats like predation. The evidence remains incomplete regarding which pressure came first or which mattered more at any given point, and scholars still debate the relative weighting of these factors, but the disagreement itself reflects something valuable about how this period is genuinely understood as a tangle of overlapping, mutually reinforcing pressures rather than any single clean cause. A separate related debate concerns the question of language and exactly when and why early humans began developing the kind of complex communication that eventually allowed for everything discussed earlier in this story. The careful teaching of danger, the passing down of accumulated survival knowledge, the firelit storytelling that may have shaped early human culture. Some researchers argue that basic vocal communication sufficient for warning, calls, and simple coordination likely existed far earlier than is often assumed, potentially stretching back well over 1 million years based on anatomical evidence from the hyoid bone. A small, delicate structure in the throat involved in producing complex sounds recovered from certain early hominin skeletons. Other researchers argue that the kind of fully structured, grammatically complex language familiar to modern humans likely emerged much later, possibly within the last 100,000 years, tied closely to the broader cognitive and cultural developments associated with anatomically modern humans specifically. This particular disagreement matters enormously to how we should imagine the inner emotional and social life of early human groups throughout this story. If complex language existed much earlier than commonly assumed, then the firelit evenings described earlier likely included far richer storytelling and explicit teaching than a more conservative interpretation would allow. If complex language developed much later, then much of the crucial knowledge transmission discussed throughout this story, the warnings about dangerous water sources, the careful instruction in tool-making likely relied far more heavily on gesture demonstration and simple vocalization than on anything resembling structured conversation. The evidence remains genuinely unresolved here, caught between anatomical clues that suggest physical capability and behavioral evidence that remains frustratingly difficult to interpret with confidence at this distance in time. There is another debate worth addressing honestly, precisely because it touches on something this story has approached carefully throughout, the question of violence between early humans themselves separate from predation by other species. The earlier correction regarding the Swatkrans remains properly attributing those particular deaths to leopards rather than interpersonal violence, should not be mistaken for a claim that early human groups never experienced violence among themselves. Evidence from later periods, including a notably disturbing site in northern Spain called Cima de los Huesos, shows clear indication of interpersonal violence dating back roughly 430,000 years, a skull bearing 2 separate puncture wounds to the same location, a pattern researchers consider difficult to explain through accident or animal predation, suggesting deliberate, repeated, intentional harm. Scholars still debate how representative this single well-documented case actually is of broader patterns of violence within early human populations more generally, since most preserved remains from this period by their nature do not allow this kind of detailed forensic analysis. It would be inaccurate given the limited evidence available to claim either that early human groups were consistently peaceful or that they were consistently violent toward one another. What the honest evidence suggests is something closer to what we might expect from any small resource-pressured human community across history, capable of remarkable cooperation and care within the group, while remaining capable under certain pressures of genuine violence as well. Neither extreme, the purely peaceful ancestor, nor the inherently violent one fits comfortably with what the careful evidence actually shows. A further area of genuine scholarly disagreement concerns the specific question raised earlier in this story of persistence hunting. The idea that early humans may have relied on patient, sustained pursuit under open sun to exhaust prey animals through heat rather than speed. While the physiological evidence for human heat management advantages remains well established and largely uncontested, considerably more debate surrounds how frequently this specific hunting method was actually used in practice as opposed to remaining a theoretical possibility supported mainly by physiological capability rather than direct archaeological evidence. Some researchers drawing on observations of a small number of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, still occasionally practicing similar techniques, argue this represents a genuine important window into ancient practice. Others caution that modern observations, however carefully studied, cannot reliably stand in for direct evidence of behavior occurring hundreds of thousands of years earlier, under different environmental and social conditions entirely. This particular disagreement illustrates something important about the broader challenge facing anyone trying to understand this period honestly. Much of what feels intuitively plausible about early human behavior, given what we know about human physiology and what we observe in carefully selected modern comparisons, cannot always be confirmed through direct, unambiguous archaeological evidence from the actual time period in question. Researchers must constantly navigate this gap between plausible inference and confirmed fact, careful never to present one as though it were simply the other, even when the inference feels compelling. There is a particular humility built into doing this kind of research, honestly one worth recognizing and respecting rather than treating as a weakness in the overall picture. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that early human survival depended on a combination of cooperative vigilance, dietary flexibility, growing tool sophistication, and gradually expanding social and cognitive complexity, though the precise weighting and timing of each of these factors remains a subject of careful ongoing scholarly investigation rather than settled final conclusion. This is not a flaw in how the story has been told throughout tonight. It is in fact a reflection of how genuine scientific understanding actually works, built slowly through careful disagreement, through researchers willing to revise earlier conclusions when better evidence eventually surfaces, exactly as happened with the Swartkrans remains discussed earlier, once mistakenly attributed to interpersonal violence before careful forensic comparison revealed the truer, sadder, more impersonal explanation. It is worth pausing here gently on what this kind of careful scholarly disagreement actually represents beyond simply academic process. It represents respect ultimately for the people whose lives this story attempts to honor. Early humans deserve to be understood as accurately as the available evidence allows, neither romanticized into purely noble survivors, nor reduced into simple instinct-driven primitives reacting blindly to immediate threat. The genuine picture pieced together carefully across decades of careful, sometimes contentious research is more complicated, more uncertain in places, and ultimately more respectful of the real complex lives these individuals actually lived than any simplified version could ever manage to be. What remains after sitting with all of this careful uncertainty is a question this story has not yet fully addressed, one that moves beyond simply understanding what happened, and beyond even understanding how researchers continue debating the finer details of that understanding. What did all of this, the danger, the cooperation, the slow accumulation of capability and knowledge, actually cost the people who lived through it individually and across generations? And what did it ultimately leave behind, both in the physical record and in something less tangible carried forward into everything that came after? That cost and what it left behind is where this story turns next. Every long sustained pressure leaves a mark, even when the species under that pressure survives and eventually flourishes. The cost of those hundreds of thousands of years of watchfulness did not simply disappear Once the worst of the danger gradually eased, it settled instead into something deeper carried forward in ways that are still in certain quiet specific corners of human biology and behavior possible to trace today. Consider something as ordinary as the human startle response, the sharp involuntary flinch triggered by a sudden noise or unexpected movement. Researchers who study this reflex have found it remarkably consistent across human populations worldwide, regardless of culture, language, or environment, activating within a fraction of a second faster than conscious thought can intervene. This kind of universal, deeply wired reflex typically indicates something shaped by sustained ancient selective pressure rather than recent cultural learning. A reflex this fast, this automatic, this consistent across every human population studied looks very much like an inheritance from exactly the kind of world described throughout this story. A world where the half-second between noticing danger and reacting to it could reasonably mean the difference between survival and death. There is a related, equally telling pattern worth examining carefully concerning the specific kinds of fear most commonly reported across modern human populations, regardless of whether the individuals reporting them have ever actually encountered the danger in question. Fear of snakes and spiders appears with remarkable consistency across cultures with little or no direct exposure to dangerous species of either suggesting something closer to an inherited predisposition than purely learned caution. Researchers studying infant attention patterns have found that even very young children, too young to have learned cultural associations about danger, show measurably faster visual detection of snake-like shapes embedded within complex images compared to other equally novel shapes. This does not mean modern humans are born with an active memory of ancient predators. It means something more specific and in its own way more interesting, that the cognitive machinery for rapidly detecting certain dangerous shapes and patterns appears to have been shaped gradually by exactly the kind of sustained predator pressure explored throughout this story. Fear of the dark deserves particular attention here, given how directly it connects to nearly everything discussed so far in this telling. Surveys conducted across multiple countries and cultures consistently find that discomfort or anxiety related to darkness, particularly unfamiliar darkness, represents one of the most commonly reported fears among both children and adults, often persisting in some mild form, even among individuals who consciously recognize there is no rational immediate danger present. This widespread persistent unease makes considerably more sense once placed against the backdrop explored earlier. In this story, hundreds of thousands of years during which darkness genuinely did represent significant measurable danger, a period during which human sensory disadvantage at night was real, severe and consequential in exactly the way modern comfortable safety has allowed us to forget. It would be an overreach to claim that every individual instance of modern unease around darkness traces directly back to ancient predation pressure in some simple unbroken line. Human psychology is shaped by countless overlapping factors: individual experience, cultural storytelling, specific personal history layered on top of whatever deeper evolutionary tendencies might exist. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how much of modern human fear response should be attributed to ancient predator pressure, specifically as opposed to other more recent sources of danger that shaped human psychology across the long span of history since this particular period ended. But the broad pattern, consistent fear responses tied to darkness and to specific predator-associated shapes appearing reliably across distant, unrelated cultures with little obvious common cause beyond shared human ancestry, points towards something real and significant inherited from precisely the conditions this story has spent so much time carefully describing. There is a quieter, less obvious cost worth examining as well. one that concerns not fear directly, but the particular shape of human social structure that emerged from this long period of sustained pressure. The deep, almost automatic human tendency to form tight, trusted in-groups, and to feel measurably more comfortable and secure within those groups compared to among strangers likely owes a meaningful debt to exactly the survival dynamics explored throughout this story. A group whose survival depended this heavily on mutual trust, shared vigilance, and reliable cooperation would have faced strong selective pressure favouring individuals capable of forming and maintaining exactly this kind of deep, durable social bond, while remaining understandably more cautious toward unfamiliar individuals or groups whose reliability and intentions could not yet be confirmed through shared experience. This connects to something genuinely consequential about how human societies eventually developed once the most severe predation pressure described throughout this story had substantially eased. The deep capacity for in-group loyalty and cooperation that likely helped early humans survive constant predator threat did not simply vanish once that specific threat diminished. It remained deeply embedded and was gradually redirected across many thousands of subsequent years toward an enormous range of other purposes, building larger communities, developing trade networks, eventually forming the foundations of organized society itself. There is something worth sitting with quietly in recognizing that the same deep instinct that once kept a small band of 20 or 30 individuals alert and cooperative through a dangerous night may represent one of the earliest roots of humanity's later much larger capacity for organized social cooperation. It would be incomplete, though, to focus only on the more abstract psychological and social consequences without acknowledging something more directly physical concerning the actual demographic toll this sustained pressure took across the span of human prehistory. Estimating ancient mortality rates with precision remains genuinely difficult, given how incomplete the fossil record inevitably is. But careful analysis of age distribution among recovered early hominin remains, where preservation allows reasonably confident assessment, suggests childhood mortality rates considerably higher than anything familiar from modern experience, with the significant proportion of individuals not surviving past the first few years of life. While disease accident and nutritional stress almost certainly contributed heavily to this pattern predation, as the evidence discussed in earlier parts of this story makes clear, represented a meaningful, recurring contributing factor specifically affecting the youngest and most vulnerable members of any group. This demographic reality carries forward into something worth understanding honestly about reproductive patterns during this period. Comparative analysis with later, better documented hunter-gatherer populations suggests that early human groups likely maintained relatively high birth rates, not because larger families were necessarily desired in the way modern populations might consider family size, but because high childhood mortality meant that a meaningful number of births were necessary simply to maintain stable group population over time, let alone allow for gradual growth. Every single survival strategy discussed throughout this story, the shared caregiving, the careful site selection, the cooperative vigilance, the gradually developing tool sophistication existed within this difficult demographic reality, a constant quiet pressure working against population growth that every other advantage had to work hard to overcome. There is a particular kind of resilience worth recognizing honestly in light of this demographic pressure, one that deserves genuine respect rather than simple pity. Despite facing childhood mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard, despite living under constant documented predation risk, despite possessing none of the medical knowledge or technological safety nets modern populations rely on, without much conscious thought, early human populations did not merely survive. Across the long span of time covered throughout this story, they gradually expanded their geographic range, increased their population, developed steadily, more sophisticated tools and social structures, and ultimately gave rise to every subsequent chapter of human history that followed. This was not achieved through any single dramatic breakthrough. It was achieved through the patient, repeated generation-spanning accumulation of exactly the strategies, the vigilance, the cooperation, the careful risk assessment explored in careful, honest detail throughout this story so far. It's worth pausing here to consider what this sustained cost actually purchased in the longer arc of human development, because the relationship between hardship and capability explored throughout this story is not a simple, comfortable narrative of suffering inevitably building strength. Many populations throughout history have faced severe sustained hardship without it producing any particular advantage, simply ending in decline or extinction instead. What made this particular period different? What allowed the cost described throughout this story to eventually translate into the foundations of later human success was the specific combination of factors already discussed at length. A body capable of unusual endurance and efficient cooling, a brain capable of supporting complex memory and planning despite its considerable metabolic expense, and a social structure capable of sustaining deep, reliable cooperation across an unusually wide and flexible network of relationships. There is a particular irony worth recognizing honestly in how this story has unfolded so far, one that deserves careful, quiet acknowledgement rather than triumphant emphasis. The very vulnerability that made early humans such consistent, frequent prey throughout much of this story. The lack of natural weapons, the poor night vision, the comparatively slow speed may have been precisely what forced the development of exactly the cooperative, cognitive, and technological adaptations that eventually allowed humans to become one of the most capable, adaptable species the planet has ever produced. Mainstream archaeology points toward this kind of vulnerability-driven adaptation as a recurring pattern across evolutionary history. More broadly, though scholars still debate how directly this general pattern applies to the specific human case explored throughout this story, given how many overlapping factors were likely involved simultaneously. What remains certain, regardless of exactly how each individual factor should be weighted against the others, is that the cost was real, sustained across an almost incomprehensible span of time and paid by countless individual lives. Most of them entirely unrecorded, unremembered by name, known to us now only through scattered bone ash and stone tool carefully studied by the researchers determined to understand and honor what those remains actually represent. Every advantage discussed throughout this story, fire cooperation, tool sophistication, growing social complexity, came at the price of generations who lived and died under conditions of genuine, sustained danger that shaped not just their immediate survival, but the deep psychological and social inheritance carried forward into every subsequent chapter of human history. This raises a final important question worth addressing carefully before this story can move toward its close. If this sustained pressure shaped human psychology, social structure, and physical capability, this profoundly what specific lasting traces of this ancient period remain visible in the modern world beyond the general psychological tendencies already discussed? Are there more direct, more concrete connections between the world explored throughout this story and the world inhabited by anyone listening tonight? Connections that might offer a clearer, more tangible sense of just how directly this ancient inheritance continues shaping daily modern life. That question and the surprising, sometimes quietly moving answers it leads toward is where this story turns next. There is a strange kind of comfort in recognizing that the room someone falls asleep in tonight, however modern, however secure, still carries faint architectural echoes of decisions made for reasons that have almost nothing to do with present-day life and everything to do with the world explored throughout this story. Consider something as simple as where the bed sits within a typical bedroom. Architects and interior designers who study spatial preference have long noted a near universal tendency across wildly different cultures for people to feel more comfortable when a bed is positioned against a solid wall, with a clear line of sight toward the door rather than placed in the open centre of a room or with its back toward an entrance. This preference is rarely explained through any conscious modern reasoning. Most people simply describe it as feeling more comfortable, more settled without being able to articulate exactly why. Researchers studying environmental psychology often connect this kind of consistent cross-cultural spatial preference to what is sometimes called prospect refuge theory, the idea that humans instinctively favour positions offering protection at the back while maintaining clear visibility of any approach from the front, precisely the kind of positioning that would have mattered enormously to a group seeking shelter within a cave or rock overhang during the period explored throughout this story. This same underlying logic appears to extend well beyond bedrooms. Outdoor seating areas in parks and plazas, when people are given a genuinely free choice of where to sit, show a measurable preference for spots near a tree, a wall or some other solid feature at one's back rather than open, fully exposed positions, even when no actual danger exists in the modern setting. Restaurant designers have long understood this intuitively, often noting that booth seating along a wall fills before open tables in the centre of a room, even when the central tables are objectively more spacious or comfortable in every measurable sense. None of this proves a direct, unbroken evolutionary line connecting modern seating preference to ancient predator avoidance with absolute certainty. Scholars still debate exactly how much of this kind of spatial preference reflects deep evolutionary inheritance, as opposed to learned cultural patterns reinforced across many subsequent generations. But the consistency of the pattern across such different modern cultures, none of which face anything resembling the predator pressure explored throughout this story, suggests something worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple coincidence. There is a particularly vivid, specific piece of evidence worth examining here, connecting directly back to the segmented sleep pattern discussed earlier in this story. Historical records from pre-industrial Europe drawn from court documents, personal diaries, and medical texts dating from the medieval period through the early modern era reference something called first sleep and second sleep. Two distinct periods of rest separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, during which people commonly prayed, talked quietly with a spouse, tended a fire, or simply lay awake in calm, unhurried reflection before returning to sleep until morning. This pattern appears so consistently across historical sources from this period that researchers studying sleep history consider it strong evidence that segmented sleep, rather than the single unbroken 8-hour stretch considered normal today, may represent something closer to the natural human baseline, only disrupted relatively recently through the widespread introduction of artificial lighting, allowing people to stay productively active well past natural darkness. This connects in a genuinely interesting way back to the watchful rotating rest pattern discussed earlier in this story, the likely ancient practice of small groups dividing sleep into shifts to maintain safety through the night. While it would be an overreach to claim a perfectly unbroken line connecting medieval first and second sleep directly back hundreds of thousands of years to early hominin watch patterns, the underlying similarity is difficult to dismiss entirely. Both involve breaking what modern populations consider normal unbroken rest into distinct segments separated by quiet wakefulness, and both occurred specifically during periods when artificial light remained limited, expensive, or entirely unavailable, leaving the natural rhythm of darkness far more directly influential over how people actually structured their nights. The widely accepted modern pattern of consolidated unbroken sleep may in this light represent the historical exception rather than the deep, ancient norm, a genuinely surprising inversion of how most people intuitively think about their own nightly rest. There is another more directly physical trace worth examining, concerning a peculiar and easily overlooked feature of human anatomy. Humans, almost uniquely among primates, possess a particularly well-developed startle and freeze response specifically triggered by sudden looming visual stimuli, something rapidly growing larger within the visual field, the kind of motion that would characterize a predator lunging from concealment. Laboratory studies measuring infant attention and physiological response have found this looming stimulus reaction present and measurable from a very early age, well before any meaningful opportunity for learned association through personal experience. Researchers studying this specific reflex argue it represents one of the more direct, measurable physical traces of sustained ancient predator pressure still detectable in modern human biology. A kind of inherited alarm system largely silent and unnoticed during ordinary modern life, but still fully present and ready to activate the instant the right kind of stimulus appears. Beyond biology and architecture, there is a particular cultural trace worth considering, carefully one that connects directly to something explored earlier in the story regarding firelight and early storytelling. Anthropologists studying folklore across an enormous range of unrelated cultures worldwide have noted a striking recurring pattern, stories specifically warning children and travelers about the particular danger of remaining outside alone after dark. From wolves in European fairy tales to a wide range of nocturnal predatory spirits found across folklore traditions on nearly every inhabited continent. The specific narrative pairing of darkness, vulnerability, and predatory danger appears with a consistency that seems unlikely to result purely from independent cultural coincidence. Some researchers studying comparative folklore argue this represents a kind of deep cultural memory, stories that may have originated as genuinely practical warnings during periods of real predator danger, later surviving and evolving across countless subsequent generations long after the original specific danger they reference had substantially diminished, retained, not because the original threat remained relevant in its exact form, but because the underlying emotional resonance danger, lurking specifically in darkness, continued to feel true and worth passing forward. It's worth pausing here on a fair, honest question this kind of claim deserves. How can researchers reasonably distinguish between genuine deep cultural memory, stretching back across an enormous span of time, and simple independent invention? Different cultures separately arriving at similar warning stories because darkness genuinely is disorienting and dangerous in fairly universal practical ways that have nothing to do with any specific ancient inheritance. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete here, and scholars studying comparative mythology continue to debate how much weight should be placed on cross-cultural similarity as evidence of deep historical connection, as opposed to simple independent human response to broadly similar practical circumstances. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the underlying emotional truth these stories capture, darkness as a time of heightened vulnerability requiring particular caution, aligns remarkably well with everything the physical and archaeological evidence throughout this story has independently suggested about the actual lived experience of early human populations. There is a final, more directly biological trace worth examining before this part of the story draws toward its close concerning something genuinely surprising to many people when they first encounter it. Modern humans across virtually every studied population show measurably elevated cortisol response, the body's primary stress hormone when placed in unfamiliar dark environments compared to unfamiliar but well-lit ones, even when no other variable differs between the two settings. This response occurs even among individuals who consciously, rationally understand there is no actual danger present in the specific environment being tested, suggesting something operating below the level of conscious belief or reasoning entirely. Researchers studying this phenomenon generally interpret it as further physiological evidence supporting everything discussed throughout this part of the story, a deep, largely automatic biological inheritance shaped by an extraordinarily long period during which darkness genuinely did correlate with measurably increased physical danger, an inheritance that has persisted essentially unchanged despite the comparatively recent evolutionarily speaking arrival of widespread artificial lighting and genuinely safe indoor sleeping environments. What makes all of this worth sitting with quietly rather than treating as simply an interesting collection of disconnected facts is the way it connects so directly back to the central thread running throughout this entire story. The hundreds of thousands of years of vigilance, cooperation, and careful risk management explored across every part of this telling did not simply end once the most severe predation pressure eventually eased. It left behind a deep, durable inheritance written not into any single dramatic monument or obvious cultural artifact, but into the quiet architecture of human psychology and behavior itself. The way a bedroom feels more comfortable arranged a certain way, the way an unexpected sound at night still pulls focus instantly and involuntarily, the way folklore across unrelated cultures keeps returning to the same basic warning about darkness and danger, the way the body itself still responds to unfamiliar dark spaces with a measurable, automatic stress response that conscious reasoning alone cannot fully override. There is something quietly remarkable in recognizing that this inheritance shaped across such an enormous, largely unrecorded span of time remains detectable and measurable today, carried forward not through any single dramatic event or deliberate cultural transmission, but through the patient ordinary mechanism of evolution, working slowly across an almost incomprehensible number of individual lives, most of them entirely unremembered, each one contributing some small immeasurable fraction toward exactly the inheritance now being discussed. The specific individuals who lived through the dangers explored throughout this story, who maintained careful watch beside dying fires, who taught their children which sounds meant safety and which meant danger, left no names behind, no individual record of who they were or what they specifically feared. And yet something of them, something real and measurable, persists still, in cortisol levels and startle reflexes and bedroom furniture arrangement in folklore told to children who have never once encountered an actual predator in the dark. It is worth considering gently what this actually means for how we should understand our own relationship to fear and vigilance today. The modern world, for most people listening to this story tonight, offers a level of safety from predation that would have been entirely unimaginable to anyone living through the period explored throughout this telling. And yet the deep biological and psychological machinery shaped by that earlier, far more dangerous world remains largely intact, still activating in response to a strange sound at night, still preferring a wall at one's back rather than open exposure, still finding something faintly unsettling in darkness that conscious reasoning cannot quite dissolve. This is not a flaw in modern human psychology. It is simply an honest, traceable inheritance from a world that shaped us far more thoroughly and for far longer than the comparatively brief span of safety most people now take entirely for granted. What remains as this long story moves gently toward its close is the question of what all of this ultimately means, taken together as a complete, careful telling rather than a series of separate facts and findings. What does it actually mean to understand that the comfortable, secure world inhabited by anyone listening tonight, safe in bed, free from any genuine fear of the dark beyond old inherited instinct, rests upon a foundation built by countless unnamed individuals who faced exactly the danger this story has tried to honor honestly throughout who survived, not through strength or speed, but through patience, cooperation, and the quiet, hard-won courage of staying alert through one more uncertain night over and over across a span of time longer than almost anything else in this entire story. That final reflection, the quiet, settled meaning this long story ultimately offers, is where this story turns next toward its close. There is one more piece of evidence worth sitting with before this story comes to rest, and it is smaller than almost anything discussed so far. Not a tool, not a footprint, not even a bone. It is a hearth. A simple, modest ring of fire-cracked stone recovered from a site in southern Africa, used and reused across what researchers estimate may have been hundreds, possibly thousands of individual nights. The ash layers built up so gradually, so consistently that they form something close to a calendar written in soot. The same small circle of ground returned to again and again by people who almost certainly never knew each other, separated by generations, by lifetimes perhaps, by centuries, each group arriving, finding the old fire pit already shaped by hands long since gone, and simply using it again, not rebuilding from nothing, continuing something already begun. There is something almost unbearably tender in that detail once you let it settle properly. Across this entire story, danger has been constant and loss has been real, named honestly rather than softened or hidden. Leopards in caves, children who did not survive their earliest years, long nights spent listening for sounds that might mean everything. None of that has been exaggerated, and none of it should be forgotten simply because the story is ending gently. The past, as this channel has always tried to honour, was genuinely brutal. That much remains true. And yet, that same hearth reused across so many generations tells a different, equally true story running quietly alongside the danger. Somebody in every single one of those generations decided it was still worth gathering, still worth feeding a small flame through the coldest hours, still worth teaching a child which sounds to fear and which to trust, still worth holding someone close enough to share warmth, still worth closing tired eyes and trusting another person to stay watchful in your place. Worth it despite everything that could go wrong and so often did. This is in the end what survival actually looked like, stripped of any false heroism and any false despair alike. It was not one extraordinary individual outwitting every danger through cleverness alone. It was an unbroken, almost invisible chain of ordinary people choosing night after night across an almost incomprehensible span of time to keep the fire going, to keep watching for each other, to keep believing in whatever quiet, unspoken way people believe such things, that staying together was worth more than facing the dark alone. Every later chapter of human history, every empire raised and lost, every quiet village and every loud, crowded city, every single person who has ever fallen asleep trusting that morning will come carries something of that same original choice inside it. The instinct to gather close, the instinct to keep a small light burning against a large darkness, the instinct even now to feel safer with a wall at your back and someone you trust nearby. History likes to remember kings and conquerors, dates and battles, the loud and visible architecture of power. But underneath all of that, quietly persistently runs something older and steadier. The simple, stubborn willingness of ordinary people to keep each other alive one uncertain night at a time, long enough for there to be a tomorrow at all. That is what this story has really been about. Not the predators in the end. Not even the danger, though the danger was real and deserved to be told honestly. It was about the watching, the waiting, the quiet trust passed from one tired pair of eyes to another, across a fire that someone somewhere has been tending, in one form or another, for longer than anyone can properly imagine. The fire is smaller now. Most of us will never know real hunger in the dark, never truly listen for something moving just beyond the light. But something old still stirs faintly when the room goes quiet at night. A wall at your back, a door that locks, a particular comfort in not sleeping completely alone. Small things, old things, carried forward without a name attached. Somewhere far back beyond memory, beyond record, a small group once sat close together as the light faded. Someone fed the fire, someone else finally allowed their eyes to close, and the night for one more time was gotten through. That is all it ever was, that is all it still is. Rest now, the fire is tended.